right, my guest this morning is Sara Church. Sara Church is a health advocate and is passionate about mental health and eliminating the stigma around it. At age 40, upon discovering that she was suffering from complex post-traumatic stress disorder, that is C-PTSD, Sara embarked on a quest to understand and overcome the condition holding her back in her personal relationships so she could live a more fulfilling life. Her book, Mending My Mind, began as a journal she kept during that process, and her children's book, A Giraffe Named Monroe, is a tale about resilience and kindness. Today, she continues to transform her own complex PTSD into a force for love and strength. She enjoys spending time with her family, hiking, reading, and traveling. Welcome to the Reading Circle microphones, none other than Sara Church. Sara, good morning again.
Good morning, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for joining me. And I know, when we were on the phone a couple of minutes ago, you said you were in North Carolina. What part?
Durham, actually, pretty close to Duke University for Coach K or Duke fans.
Oh, yes, I will. I'm familiar with the area. As a matter of fact, I have an aunt, and she's listening now, but she's a little bit further south. Or I have to look at my directions to see. I think it's south of it, but she's down in Sunset Beach, closer to the Wilmington area. And,
oh, nice.
And so, my mother is from North Carolina, so that's why I asked when you said North Carolina, my ears perked up. But in any event, I am so glad, and I'm so glad you are on the East Coast and not the West Coast, because at least it's not 4 o'clock in the morning there. It's 7 o'clock in the morning here. So we're going to be talking about your book, Mending My Mind. And as I was sharing with you prior to us coming on the air, mental health right now is a hot topic. Matter of fact, the bulk of my guests this year, somewhere in their work, has something to do with mental health somewhere. And not all of them, but a good number of my guests this year. And I was sharing with the listening audience, it's not that I'm seeking you all out. Your publicists are actually emailing me asking if I'm interested to have their client be interviewed. And it just happened so a lot of the books that are coming my way are dealing with mental health. And what I was saying earlier also was I honestly believe, as a result of this pandemic, as a result of COVID, that a lot of folks, COVID, I think, was that tipping straw, that tipping point, that straw that broke the Campbell back. The stress of that on top of everything else, I think, exacerbated folks that were already struggling. So I don't know if that's the case, because since I am not a therapist or a doctor, but I just have a sneaky suspicion that the pandemic had a lot to do with what's going on.
Yeah, I totally agree. And first and foremost, thanks for creating a space for conversation that impacts so many of us. As we're talking about earlier, about 60% of us have had a childhood traumatic event that potentially shaped us. And there's a lot of great data on the CDC's website around adverse childhood experiences, for years to come. And then you add on COVID and a lot of stressors going on in the world, on top of that, and it can really exacerbate things for people and creates, more openness for us to have these important conversations.
That's the one thing a guest that I had a few weeks ago said the same thing, that they thought something that's good that came out of the pandemic was exactly what you just said, that now folks are beginning to open up and be more transparent and to talk about it. And it's being less stigmatized, because you actually had now athletes and Olympians that were now refusing to compete because they would straight up say, I'm not competing because my mind is not right. I'm not going to compete in that event because my head is just not there. It was the tennis player. I know she didn't do the French Open because she said she was struggling mentally. I remember there was one of the Olympians on the balance beam of the bar. She wouldn't compete in the next event because she was struggling mentally. I just saw something. It was a football player. He just wrote a book not long ago. I happened to be watching the news and they were featuring him. He was being interviewed, and I have to think of his name. But he was struggling with mental illness as an NFL player. So it is definitely there. And when you say 60% had a traumatic childhood experience, that could kind of explain, because this is the thing. And I work in the school system. I work with kids, and I'm constantly trying to help parents and teachers understand that in many instances, what happens to our children will impact them when they are adults.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of data around this, and there are a couple of reasons for this. So when we experience traumatic events, and for folks who may not know what C-PTSD is, complex trauma, it's generally a series of traumatic events over time. So, in my case, growing up in a household with substance abuse and there was poverty and a lot of stress around that creates a stressful experience that a child's brain and nervous system is literally developing in simultaneously, in a high stress environment. So it changes our stress response systems. And then we create different coping strategies to manage that. And some are deemed positive coping, strategies by society, and some, negative. But nonetheless, they're adaptations to the environment we grew up in. And going back to your point on the athletes, for example, Simone Biles, when she, opened up about, not competing in the Olympics, that was a watershed moment in the mental health community to have that kind of courage, and for her to also prioritize her physical safety and health and open up really created, more pathway for conversations like these to happen.
That's exactly who I was talking about. I can't remember their name, but Simone Biles, and I think the tennis player was Osaka or something. I'll have to look her up, but I always get her name messed up. But exactly who I was talking about was Simone Biles in terms of, and it did, and the real odd thing about it was when all of them gave their reasons, people thought they were either faking or were making excuses, or, in the tennis player's case, they were angry that she would not compete in the French Open, even after she had disclosed, I am not mentally there.
Yeah, what I've noticed are kind of two camps that personally, anecdotally, from my experience, folks fall into, because it's an uncomfortable and hard conversation to have. And this is how I used to be before I actually went into therapy. I was like, you leave in the past, you suck it up, you just, muscle through. And so that's kind of one kind of philosophy I've seen and I used to have for myself, like, don't talk about it, just kind of leave it where it is and work hard and do my best each day. And then when symptoms later started interacting with my marriage, and caused problems in my personal relationships. And also I didn't feel very fulfilled. I was like, well, maybe I should question that and open myself up emotionally and share and not leave the past in the past, but explore how it might be contributing to my present. Those sorts of conversations make some folks really uncomfortable. And then you add in the whole sports world to that, and you're a fan and, of a player or a game or a team, and you're in that camp that you just leave the past in the past, it could even potentially create, I'm speculating here, but kind of more frustration and even maybe even discomfort for folks, opening up and being vulnerable in that way.
Well, that's why I applaud their courage. And the book I was talking about with the football player, his name is Jay Glazer. Jayglazer, and his book is called Unbreakable: How I Turned My Depression and Anxiety into Motivation, and You Can Too. Now, this is an NFL player. You're talking about folks in the French Open, you're talking about folks in the Olympics, you're talking about folks in the NFL, or whatever walk of life they're in, that those of us on the outside looking in have no clue. We do not suspect that because, like you just said, you kind of go into that philosophy of suck it up, let the past be the past, and you feel or you think you're actually moving on when in reality your past is actually messing up your present and possibly your future.
Oh, totally. Like that statement really hits home with me because you're leaving your past in your past, but your past has funny ways of showing up that you're not always consciously aware of. So, for some people I've met in the C-PTSD community, it can be, overeating, it can be substance abuse, problems with sleep, etc. For me, it cropped up as toxic overwork. I would work 12, 14 hours a day. I would be, on my phone at the dinner table, with my spouse checking work emails. I was emotionally not present. So I was using work, in a way that kept me disconnected from my emotions, because I didn't really want to deal with them. But when being disconnected from my emotions, it meant I was disconnected from the people I love the most, and myself. So there are different ways that even when we think we are doing fine, that it crops up and we don't even realize what it is. And for me, I didn't realize what it was until I actually kind of separated and walked out of my marriage and went into a therapist's office, and then, started having a lot of nightmares and classic PTSD symptoms in parallel, at that time that it broke through. And the other really cool thing that you mentioned about Jay's title, which is my experience as well, is once we start to go through the uncomfortable process of dealing with this, stuff, it can actually be a tool that makes us stronger. So, for example, I just had to learn to do two things: connect, with my emotions. And once I did that, I could harness them in a way that actually kind of added more kind of power, compassion, strength, etc. to my life. But the process to get there at first wasn't very fun. But nonetheless, I feel stronger now than I was when I thought I was being strong before dealing with things.
Absolutely. And I'm glad to hear that, because that gives hope. And the person that I've been trying to call, and I'm going to have to remember her name because I reference her quite often, is Naomi Osaka. And that's who I was talking. She was the tennis player who was struggling the same way. Now, she's like right up there with Venus and Serena, or at least heading that direction. But she was able to back out and say, look, I can't do this because there's too much going on. I'm not mentally focused. I'm not mentally there. And like I said, folks were, angry. Sponsors were angry. Fans were angry. And she said, look, I have to do what's best for me. And at this point, I told the audience in the 6 o'clock I was going to read the preface. So I'm going to read this preface. I read this preface and I was like, oh my. When I turned 40, my life seemed great. I was married to a terrific woman. I had a successful career in biotech doing meaningful work, and I enjoyed my friendships. On the surface, my life was peaceful and I was content. Yet I was unfulfilled and a workaholic. That's what you were just talking about. My wife and I had grown apart so much that divorce was on the table. Of course, this happens to couples all the time, and people are able to move through it. But I couldn't. I went into a tailspin, uncovering long-buried skeletons from the past. My days became filled with numbness, anxiety, and shame. My nights with fear and nightmares. At times, the world started to seem unreal, as if I were watching a movie. I didn't understand why I felt so profoundly troubled, and I couldn't explain what was happening. What I did know, once I discovered I had trauma-induced amnesia, wow, and see, I didn't even know that existed, was that I couldn't avoid dealing with it by pretending that I had it all together. To seek answers, I sought therapy. In fact, I saw 6 therapists over the course of 3 years. I discovered that unbeknownst to me, I had complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Beneath the veneer of my generally calm exterior lay a history of childhood trauma, some of which I couldn't even remember, and all of which was unresolved. This prevented me from connecting with my wife and from connecting to myself and knowing my essence. Until my past was brought to the surface and healed, I would remain deeply unsettled and disconnected. The worst part was I hurt people I loved because of my inability to tolerate or sustain intimate relationships. My story is far too common. According to the CDC, 61% of people have had at least one adverse childhood experience, which is a potentially traumatic event that can change brain development, affect how the body responds to stress, and create difficulty in relationships. Unresolved trauma can also wound others, including our kids, when we pass it along to them if it's left untreated. Even though my PTSD was not my fault, it was my responsibility to address it. But dealing with my past was a gut-wrenching slog, In order to change my life, I had to mend my mind, hence the name of the book. I had to untangle the damage that was done to my nervous system and rewire my brain. I stuck with it, determined to live a more meaningful life, one with closer relationships with my family and friends. And I also wanted to become a parent, so I did the work. I fell a ton, and I got up and kept plugging away. While life didn't necessarily become easy, it did become a whole lot better. This book began as a journal, writing as one of the techniques I used to heal. I got involved with the C-PTSD Foundation, where the stories this community courageously shared helped me. Later, I found the guts to publish an essay, and that experience empowered me to come forward about my PTSD. More people speaking up and sharing their stories about mental health, I believe, will help others. Since the pandemic started, we're in agreement. I've been inspired by the increase in public conversation around this topic, and I'm optimistic that the discussion is a step in the right direction toward better health and well-being, as well as access to mental health resources. And maybe, if we heal ourselves, we will be better able to improve our world. Trauma-related disorders are often underdiagnosed, undertreated, mistreated, and minimized. If you or someone you love is suffering, I am sorry. Healing is possible. There's hope. Here is my human story. Now, that's from the preface, and I felt compelled to read the whole thing to help the listening audience understand what you were dealing with. And these things, Sarah, are going on inside your mind. That's not necessarily what anybody else outside of you knows what's going on.
Well, yeah, exactly. I wanted to put on, a mask or, be in the closet about it and put on a normal face to the world. So when my life got really challenging and the skeletons from the past started breaking through in nightmares and in therapy as we were unpacking stuff, I tried to look more normal on the outside. I was getting pedicures and getting new clothes and, working out more, et cetera, because I really had so much shame around it. I didn't want anyone to know that I had these struggles from kind of the background I grew up in or any of these symptoms, especially professionally. And in my career, I still work as an executive in biotech, and I was afraid people would judge me or my abilities to, be a good leader at work as well. But yeah, there's a lot to unpack in this opening, and it's always interesting when I read it or hear someone else share any of it. But I really think most humans have, traumatic experiences, and they come in two categories: things we've experienced, from other people, and then macro things. There are whole communities, the Black community, the Holocaust survivors, et cetera, where there's collective trauma. And then there are things like COVID, societal things that are impacting us all. So I really think my experience isn't special. I think it's pretty universal, even though it manifests differently for different people. And so that's another reason I wanted to share other people's stories have really helped me. Anyway.
Well, see, again, and if you're not someone who's either dealing with someone who has it or you have it yourself, most people will tend, and this is where I think the stigma comes in, or many people think depression is just being sad, have no idea that depression runs so deep and usually can turn into these various other names. I just shared where Samuel L. Jackson, it was on Twitter, he was trending because he had made a statement that he's fearful that he's going to have Alzheimer's like his parents had. And I said, now, as much junk as Samuel L. Jackson talked, it was interesting to have him get transparent to say that he's afraid that he's going to get Alzheimer's, because Alzheimer's is mental as well. Folks who are not struggling with anything mental or not dealing with someone who has something, they tend to brush it off. They kind of, get over it. Or like you said, suck it up. So how do you, because now you're trying to tell yourself that. You're trying to tell yourself, suck it up. And then you have the forces coming back against you that's not allowing you to suck it up. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, it was a struggle for me because, there's a big part of me, I've worked my way up, worked my way through college and grad school, and hard work paid off for me in many ways. And it's the messaging that we get as well, is just kind of suck it up and work hard. But I knew it's almost hard to put words around. Sometimes there's this gut feeling or this whisper like, gosh, something's just a little off. And so, once I saw that by not sucking it up, I hurt my, wife at the time, and I was just keeping people shut out and just really not connecting or being an emotionally available person in the world. And I thought about the consequences to other people, and, I did want to have kids, and I know that trauma can be passed along if it's not dealt with. As once I stopped thinking about myself being strong and, hey, am I impacting other people because of it? Then that's what motivated me, to initially get treatment. And one of the reasons I saw different therapists is it took trial and error to find actually a trauma specialist, because it's a different form of therapy than going to, a marriage counselor, which we did, or, an individual kind of talk therapist. So I had to find the right folks. And once I ended up with, a specialist that understood trauma, it made sense. And there were things, I realized I could use my hard work and my sucking it up and my strength to really kind of look at some really hard, memories and things from the past. And then, the few memories that cropped up that I had pushed down and not wanted to remember as a coping mechanism. And those memories came back later. But I realized how much strength it took to actually, am sucking it up in a way to like actually deal with these hard things. That I kind of redefined my definition of strength a little bit.
Now, it's interesting you were talking about in terms of now hurting other people. Do you realize as you're going through that you're actually hurting someone else, or are you actually operating kind of like in the blind or in a spot that you don't even know what you're doing?
Yeah, like for me, I had a sense that I wasn't, and one definition about hurting people, sometimes we think about hurting people in egregious ways. We read on the news about a violent crime or assault, but then there's much more subtle ways that we can hurt people. So in my case, being emotionally unavailable or not at all present, with my spouse at the time, when she was sharing about, a hard day at work, as little as that sounds, to shut somebody out. And folks know it if they've felt someone they love totally withdraw from them. It just doesn't feel good. And so it started there. But the ultimate thing for me is I actually walked out of my marriage, and she was really confused. Like, why did you just leave?
Correct.
And so that was very hurtful. And so, I wasn't totally conscious that I was hurting other people, because I defined hurt as the horrible things I would see on the news where someone physically hurts somebody. But no, once I kind of opened my eyes to not being an emotionally open person in the world can cause harm. And then it was really clear to me when I walked out of my marriage that wasn't, the right way, to handle that. And it just wasn't kind or fair to a really, good human being and good partner. Then I was like, I'm definitely hurting people. I need to, work on this and figure out what's going on that's driving me to, basically kind of sabotage relationships. And even before I was married, I had long relationships with great people, and I just kind of walked out, when things, got a little challenging. So, yeah.
Well, it's interesting as you say sabotage, because I would think, and maybe I'm wrong, but I would think now, since we're talking the trauma, and because to me, the whole separation, divorce, the whole thing, all of that's traumatic as well. But I would think, based on what you just described, wouldn't you now get into a cycle? Oh my God, I'm horrible, I'm terrible. Now, wouldn't you get into a guilt track of, I can't believe I did that to my wife, I can't believe I did that to my partner. Now, do you now get into a spiral of guilt that's now added on top of your stress?
No, you hit the nail on the head. The guilt was absolutely overwhelming, and I've read kind of many different books and things that a lot of experts have summed up pain and suffering in a sort of similar way. There's the pain, like the pain of being away from someone you love, the pain of having your marriage not work, or the pain of change. And then there's the suffering, and that's all the kind of interpretation we put on it, all the guilt, all the shame, all of that. So I was definitely kind of having lots of guilt and shame over my behaviors. And quite frankly, my ex and people who loved us as a couple, had pain and suffering as well because of, my behaviors at the time. And shame and guilt are so prevalent with trauma in general. So in general, anyone who's faced trauma often need to work through guilt and shame as emotions.
So again, now, so how do you, someone who now is trying to support you, what thoughts do you have or advice do you have for folks who are trying to now that you've come to the point, you kind of got a feel for what's going on with you? What is your advice to folks who are now trying to support you based on what you're dealing with?
And for anyone listening, they're supporting people they love or themselves if they've experienced trauma by getting information about it. It's really easy to make, an assumption that someone's intentionally kind of doing something to hurt us, but they, in fact, may be hurting or struggling with something that's totally unrelated, but that's showing up in their relationship with each other, but it may be totally unrelated to them. Another thing that's helpful, and quite frankly, another reason I like speaking up is getting, a therapist that specializes in trauma. And that's hard to do, and that's why I'm speaking up. There's a lot of access and health disparities to mental health. But if that's not possible, there's other free sources of information. There are foundations like the C-PTSD Foundation with lots of stories and resources, meetup groups and books. And books were so helpful to me. And so there's all of those things are helpful, and finding one safe person to share your story with. One of the best things to help people heal trauma is to have social support and connection. But the paradox is that we don't like to talk about it. We hide, and so we can't get that support, that healing support. And so those are just a few things off the top of my head. No, absolutely right. I mean, and because going back to what you were saying, the outside world thinks you're doing something intentionally. And it's a hard sell for those to say, no, the person's not doing that on purpose. It's a part of the illness. And it really is a hard sell for those that have no clue of what you're talking about or what you're going through. So because for the person on the receiving end, and all the literature and all the research says is don't take it personally. And what I say all the time is, well, it's kind of hard to not take it personally when you're the target. But at the end, at the end of the day, that is, like you just said, they're not intentionally, or whoever's suffering with that, if they're doing these things, are not doing something intentionally per se about you. It really is about the pain and everything that's going on inside of them. Yeah, absolutely. Kind of that said, we're all human beings here. And, I had to unpack a lot of what it means to be human. And it hurts, if someone who's had a traumatic experience is not treating you right. And so it is important for for example, for the people in my life, they needed to put boundaries up and take care of themselves and do what they needed to do for them. And And although, I've gotten, great support from those closest to me, I was on the hook, to do the work and, get treatment and work on myself. Nobody could do that journey for me. And so it's a really hard balance of how to provide kind of support for someone going through, traumatic healing, I should say. It's a hard balance to provide support, but also take care of yourself. So it's a hard one.
It is. And for those in the listening audience, if you've just joined us, my guest this morning is Sara Church. We're talking about her book, Mending My Mind. And I'm so appreciative of her because she's being transparent and upfront about an issue that really has always been around. It's just really kind of coming to the forefront now, and people are talking about it because it's always been stigmatized. You know what, folks? The stigma is folks think anytime you're dealing with anything mental that they're going to be called crazy. Or if you now admit that you're going to a therapist or that you're going to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist or whatever, that you're going to be called crazy, that people are going to be looking at you sideways because they think something is wrong with you. And the truth of the matter is, it's an illness like any other illness, just like diabetes, just like cancer, just like high blood pressure, just like whatever, any other illness that you come up with. A mental illness is just another illness, but it needs to be treated. So the question would be, is there hope? Now, I'm talking to you and you sound great. You would never know that you had any issues in the world listening to you, and I'm sure the same watching you. So the question, is there hope?
Oh, there's lots of hope. Absolutely. We are still all kind of learning a lot about mental health and brain and mental illness and how it all works. And I think the brain's probably one of the least understood organs in the body at this point. But what I can say today is that there are mental health issues that can be resolved. Trauma is an example. So, for example, when I started my journey, I had, sleep problems. I was waking up in the middle of the night, waking up soaked in sweat from nightmares, etc. I don't have nightmares at all. I haven't had one in a very, very long time. And so my symptoms have gone away. And so I think and we see this with people who have suffered from depression. Those symptoms can go away, anxiety, and sometimes people need medications to get help. In my case, I needed, to see a therapist. But there are solutions out there. There are, medication solutions. There are therapy solutions. There are holistic solutions. Writing and exercise, etc., have been big for me. But there's tons of hope out there, but it is some trial and error for, many folks.
For the support person or for the partners, is it worth putting in the work? Because there's a lot of work, and that's a rhetorical, because that's a decision for everyone's going to have to make on their own. But it is a long road. It is a long road, and you have to have patience, and you have to be able to, have some thick skin.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And there are kind of support and resources for loved ones of people dealing with mental health issues. I agree it's rhetorical and so individualized. I can say for me, the criteria I would have, having kind of worked through PTSD, if I was ever on the other end of it, and was with somebody else that was dealing with some kind of mental health challenge, is, are they taking, responsibility? Are they willing to do work at it? Are they taking action steps towards getting better? And so that would be the biggest thing for me, because in my case, I found that I was able to heal, most of my symptoms, knock on wood, I hope. I am such a, happier, more fulfilled person than I ever was, and have much more kind of capacity for giving to others and generosity than, I did before I ever got any treatment and pretended everything was perfect.
So actually some good actually came from that once. Did you ever bottom out? Because, I'll ask that question. And then in terms of bouts or episodes, Generally, how long do they last, or do they vary? And then did you get to a bottom out point that caused you to now seek help?
Yeah, I did. There were a couple, probably 4 or 5 low points, actually. So I don't know which one was the bottom. But for me, the catalyst was I walked out on my marriage, and I had a good, peaceful marriage. We didn't fight or have drama. We worked together fairly well as a team, so it just didn't make sense. When we're just dealing with the normal stress of life, relocated for my job, and the company I worked for got acquired, and discussions around having kids, like these were very normal things that married couple or folks in very long-term relationships, they come up throughout, relationships. And I just got overwhelmed, and instead of, and just kind of walked out and went to an Airbnb. And so that was a low point in my life. I knew I was avoiding instead of dealing with these like regular, life challenges. So that was a bottom, because I knew it was on me. And then the symptoms, like once I let them come out, because I just kind of kept them at bay, the kind of traumatic childhood experiences, then they overwhelmed me, because now I was allowing myself to feel all of these emotions. And there's really kind of 2 skills, I think, to be an emotionally mature person. One is to be able to feel all of your emotions. And then number 2, then you have to regulate and manage those. And so that learning that skill to allow myself to feel everything, but then manage my emotions in a constructive way, that took some time, and I got some bumps and bruises along the way. But the symptoms themselves, like nightmares, etc., for the most part, they really did go away. There have been a couple triggering things here or there, but right away I'm like, oh, I'm feeling like anxious. My heart rate feels fast. Like I could immediately kind of recognize those, and okay, I need to go on a walk. I need to, I'm going to skip the coffee today. I feel, a little anxious, and have tea. And so then I learned these tools, that as I was kind of getting better from the PTSD, that helped me manage things. So I'm not sure if that answers your question.
No, actually it does. As a matter of fact, you brought up another, and this is the way my show works. I always tell my guests, I really do not sit here with a list of written questions. I will scan, and I don't even get a chance to read the book until after the interview is over, from cover to cover. I get a chance to skim it and scan it, and I'll pull out talk points. But I don't have a question list per se sitting in front of me. My questions are actually derived from the conversation. You just said a word, you said trigger. Let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about triggers. What are some things that, and again, I'm quite sure it varies based on what the trauma was as a child. That could be your trigger.
Yeah, I'll give a great definition my therapist gave to me when I found this amazing kind of trauma specialist, one that I think we're probably all familiar with. We think about PTSD and combat veterans, and the sound of a gun, a car backfiring can remind them of a gun, and maybe they'll do one thing, flight, or one of 2 things, fight or flight. So maybe they'll, jump down on the sidewalk, or maybe they'll run off or whatnot. So that could be a trigger, that sound. For example, lots of us have triggers around things. I was chatting with a friend yesterday who was telling me she has triggers around when people comment about her clothes because she's uncomfortable with her body size. And so when someone comments, even if it's positive on something she's wearing, she feels anxious and stressed. And so, physical comments can be a trigger for her. For example, for me, one that came up really early is if I'm in a really messy house or really kind of cigarette smoke smells. Like I grew up in a house with a lot of substance abuse, and it was kind of really messy at times, and, a lot of bad smells and those sorts of things. I start getting kind of stressed, and I've kept my house as an adult, like meticulously clean. And I didn't realize that was me kind of overcompensating, like color coding all the clothes in my closet, organized by category. Like, I didn't understand kind of why my behavior was that. So those are some examples of triggers.
No, see, and I'm going to go back again. I work in a school. I've been working with children forever, and I can tell instances where something is going on in the home. And as a matter of fact, I just accepted a new student the other day. Mom came in and was talking, and she was telling everything that was going on in the house. And it gave me a clear understanding as to why the child was doing what he was doing. He's only in the 3rd grade. But once she gave us the backdrop of what was going on at home, it explained everything as to why this child was doing what he was doing. What we do as adults, and we don't even think about it as adults, impact kids so badly. And kids don't say, this is the thing, as a child, everything that's going on, they don't say anything. They just internalize everything. And now that internalization is a buildup. And then you start now adding other traumas on top of that. And before you know it, at some point, just like you said in your preface about being 40, and all of a sudden, the floor drops from under you. So it's happening, and it's always been happening, except for you just didn't have folks who were talking about it. Because this is the other thing. For those suffering with that, they still function. They still go to work. They still go to church. They still go to social events. But on the inside, they're being ripped apart.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm LGBT. For me, coming out of the closet for my trauma was much harder. You cannot see it. And you can't see in many cases LGBT either. But this was a much harder experience for me, kind of, I guess, coming out, so to speak, because if anything, I was rewarded for functioning so well. I was getting promoted at work. I had, nice house. Like, society was telling me I was doing great, lots of friends, like, things looked so good, according to what we're told looks good. And I was rewarded for being put together. I was running marathons and all of these sorts of things. So I couldn't agree more. But on the inside, there was, turmoil and just not feeling fulfilled, really.
Well, I think each time I have a guest on that we've been talking about mental health, I've said this quote. Now, I don't know if he actually said it or not, but at least if you look at the memes and images, it's been attributed to him, and that was Robin Williams. And the quote says, "Folks who are dealing with depression or suffering with depression are not faking being ill. They are faking being well."
Oh, that's really powerful. I've never read that, but I totally relate to that. Same for, I think, a lot of people I met in the PTSD community and folks that I've talked to that have, anxiety. There's just so much, sadly, shame around it, and why it's so important to tell these stories. And I love what you shared about your 3rd grader, because it's not just us when we're faking it. We're impacting other people, and by not dealing with things, I think, and children are in a really vulnerable situation, in that, they're dependent on their caregivers, and so they really need to trust and see them as good and protect them. I was very protective of my mom, because I didn't want to end up in a foster home, and because I loved her, and lots of different reasons. I would have never told anyone as a child that I was struggling. And then, also their brains and nervous systems are developing. And so to make, have the environments, it doesn't have to be perfect. We're human, but as good as possible for our children. It's going to create a better world. There's a ripple effect to that. So
you are 100% correct, because as I met with that mother and she was sharing her story, she actually started crying herself. I mean, when she started telling us what was going on in the home, and we said what he was doing in school, and we said, no, you can rest and be assured what's going on with you and his dad is impacting him. And I recommended to her, he's only in the 3rd. I said, but you can get him a therapist now. I mean, whenever I was going through my first marriage, when I was going through the separation and divorce on my first marriage, I'm on my 2nd marriage now, people were telling me, get your kids therapy, get your kids. I said, no, they're all right. They're good. They're fine. They're good. I regret that to this minute, because my oldest, I honestly believe, and she may very well be suffering with because I'm reading, as I read your preface, And the disclaimer, my oldest daughter may very well be suffering from this as well, from me and her mother separating and divorcing, because some of the symptoms and some of the descriptions that you put in there, I've seen in her. But I'm saying all that to say I regret the fact now, because people were telling me, get them therapy, let them go to a therapist, let them talk to us. And I didn't. And I regret that. And so I share that with the parents when they come in sharing stories with me like that. And I said, get that young man to some type of therapist where he can talk this thing out, because if not, when he's grown, he's going to have issues, and we see it already in the 3rd grade. So you're absolutely right in terms of, and my hope is, as we're talking about this, folks, the title of the book is very easy title, Mending My Mind. If you're dealing with someone who is struggling, or if you're struggling yourself, I highly recommend getting the book. It's called Mending My Mind. The author is Sara Church. Her name is very easy, Sara. The last name is Church, just like we go to church, Church. This topic, like I said, it is a hot topic, and I'm glad it's a hot topic, because you're right. In terms of folks being able to get healed, if we don't start talking about it, exactly what that quote says, you got a lot of folks faking being well. Because we always think, especially in the school system, whenever kids say, I got a stomach ache, I don't feel good, you're just faking, you don't want to go to school. Mommy, I don't feel like going, I'm sick, you just trying to get out of going to school. But that quote says the exact opposite. You're faking being well. That's deep.
Yeah, no, totally. And the two things that I really love what you're opening up and sharing about in your personal life and with your 3rd grade students. There's kind of two things that came to my mind. One of those is, in addition to faking it, I was also running from it, but I didn't know. I was running towards all these status goals, like get this promotion, get this nice house, run a marathon. But I was really running too hard and running away from my past and, trauma, poverty, shame, all those things, trying to get these external things that didn't necessarily make me feel fulfilled. Not that I'm not grateful that, have a home to live in, or those sorts of things. But the other thing, though, when you're talking about your student, I have one story in the book around a student that impacted me. So on the side, I taught a high school class for Seattle Public Schools, career and technical education. And I have a student, I changed his name to Dwayne in the book, who really impacted me in such a profound way. So he was a high school student in my class, and a really intelligent student. I looked through all of their files, and he, high test scores and those sorts of things, but just, mediocre grades. And he wasn't turning in assignments in class, but when he did, the words that he wrote were just, he was just so intelligent, so much potential. Every student, as you know, has so much potential. And so I had him lead a case study, medical careers. So a medical case study in my class. I said, Dwayne, will you lead this group? And I watched his eyes pop, get really large, and it looked like, his pupils may be dilating. It's hard when you're standing in front of a classroom, and his body stiffened, and he's like, no. And then he started, he argued with me, like, I don't want to. Why do I have to do an assignment that doesn't matter? And I wondered for a second, and if I had not been treated for what I had been treated for, I, might assume that he wasn't being, constructive in the class. But I was like, he might be triggered about something here. Let me, take a deep breath, take a step back, and just ask him a clarifying question. Do you feel this way, with this in particular, or do you feel this way often in high school? And it opened up a dialogue, and I watched him relax. And after that, he turned in every single assignment on time. And it just I don't agree with just sending kids to the office or whatnot. There's reasons people behave the way they behave.
Correct.
And so it made me a better, what I've been through made me a better, teacher or parent or friend. So anyway.
No, you're absolutely. That's been my experience as well. My antenna is way up now, and in terms of dealing with the kids, and that's what I'm constantly sharing with my teachers. Like, wait a minute, there's a root here. They're not just being bad for the sake of being bad. There's something going on that's driving this behavior. Interestingly enough, something that you said there about the acquiring of things or whatever. A few weeks ago, a couple months ago, I'm gonna have to get you all together because I'm hearing very similar stories. I had Dr. Ellen Albertson on. She calls herself the Midlife Whisperer, and her book was called Rock Your Midlife: 7 Steps to Transform Yourself and Make Your Next Chapter Your Best Chapter. But she now shared that she suffered with some mental health issues as well, and that's one of the reasons she kept getting all these degrees. She kept going through. That's why she went on to get the doctorate, and it was the same thing that you just described, and the same thing you just said. Even with all that, it still didn't fulfill.
Yeah, totally. I mean, my, therapist told me you're over-functioning, and that's a problem too. And honestly, if I wasn't over-functioning, I probably would have gotten help a long time ago. Like, I assumed, mental illness meant you had substance abuse problems, or you were getting in lots of trouble, or there were, I don't know, these like egregious kind of big things. And quite frankly, I have so much more understanding for all of these things now, like what drives behavior after getting treatment. A lot of people who are using substances, like my mom was a way to try to kind of deal with pain as a coping tool. And so I have so much more compassion in general. And then, but for me, I was on Dr. Albertson's end of the spectrum. Like, let me kind of keep achieving, because then I'm proving to myself I'm good or worthy or okay.
Right.
Yeah. So for me, it just showed up, on the other end of the spectrum.
No, and like I said, I've learned so much about this topic, particularly over the last year or so, and it is fascinating. And another word you just said was compassion. It does cause you to have compassion on people because you really don't know what they're dealing with and what they're struggling with. And that's one of the things that, and my school is a little bit different because it's an all-boys school. It's a leadership academy, and we get a little bit of leeway to do things a little bit different. So I had a conversation with the boys the other day about the difference between building somebody up and tearing someone down. And we talked about this whole notion of you don't know what your classmates may be going through on the inside of them. So that one put down that you may be the last straw for them. Because I walked into the classroom and the teacher was talking about, I saw the spirit go out of him. He shared with me what you all said with him in the cafeteria, and I could see the life go out of him based on what you said. And that started the whole discussion. And I mean, it turned out into like a confession session, boys crying, the whole 9 yards. I mean, it was a wonderful session. But we got into the whole thing of, rather than you, because we always talk about we are brothers keepers, why are you guys tearing each other down? Why aren't you building each other up? So the next day I get on morning announcements. I say, now look, this is the challenge of the day. You have to compliment at least 5 people. You have to compliment at least 5 people before the school day is over. And
this is so awesome. This I'm literally smiling right now. I love this story and what you're doing with these students. For me, I found one thing that made me more compassionate with others and just, I think kind of kinder person is first I had to learn to be compassionate with myself. So I had to stop, once I stopped giving myself such a hard time, then I was so much kinder to other people. And so that self-relationship was something I had to kind of rebuild as well. But I love what you're sharing.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, and that's where it all starts, is with the self. And this whole thing that we're talking about is all right. You went through the trauma, but because of the traumas, it's caused you to not feel good or to love yourself. And because of not loving yourself, it's making you unable to love anybody else. Hence the relational issues. But one of the things we ask because our school, you have to apply and be interviewed. It's not like we're, exclusive. We're not. And we're not alternative either. We're kind of like in the middle. We're not gifted and talented, but we're not alternative. But the parents have to interview, the boys have to apply. One of the questions we ask the kids, because we interview the parent and we interview the child. One of the questions we ask the child is, give us 3 things you like about yourself. And no, not that you like to play basketball, not that you like to play video games. Give us 3 things that you like about you. And Sarah, when I tell you that's a hard question for them to answer, they look, their eyes roll up in their head, they turn their heads, they scrunch their face up. They struggle with coming up with 3 things that they like about themselves. Then finally, after working them through, they'll say, well, I'm athletic. Okay, good. I'm kind. All right, good. I'm loving. Oh, you're getting there. Oh, I'm playful. Okay, I'm funny. And there you go. Now we're getting into what attributes or characteristics about it. And then after we go through all that, I tell them why we asked that question. And it's exactly what I just said. It's like, look, we want to find out how do you feel about yourself? Because if you don't love you, if you don't like you, then we're going to have some issues with you. And so, once I explain that, and they're like, oh, okay. But that is one of the questions. As a matter of fact, yesterday we were doing a lesson on social emotional learning, SEL, because it was SEL day yesterday. And the guidance counselor asked that very question. Write down on this index card 3 things you like about yourself. Again, I saw the boys struggling because they, when they asked that question, they automatically leap to, I like to play basketball. Like, nope, that's not what we asked you. We said, what do you like about you? So you're absolutely right that the crux of the issue is being able to love and like yourself.
Yeah, no, I love this example that you shared of the 3 things with the boys. And it's a really hard thing to do. So a lot of these things we hear or we read about, like, it's like, oh, that makes sense, like yourself. But the how to do it,
right.
That was like, in my journey of all of this stuff, I had to figure out, well, how? like the what made sense to me. And there's so much, trial and error, falling down and getting spun up and figuring out how. And for me, I can say, it did start with kind of taking time to listen to the thoughts I was having.
Right.
And use some kind of mindfulness, practices and tools around that. But it's a discipline like anything else. Like,
correct.
You get better at shooting basketball if you practice every day.
Correct.
As I spent more time kind of reflecting and monitoring my thoughts, I got better and better at it. And I also had to challenge beliefs that I had that just weren't true. Like, it's selfish to love yourself. Like, I was telling myself I was a horrible person because I walked out on my marriage. And it's like, you don't even deserve, to think you're a decent person, right now. And so for me, I had to also, in addition to like behavioral practices, I had to challenge core beliefs. And then I realized, wait, once I'm really good to myself, like, I am so much better to everybody else around me.
Correct.
And then I realized, wait, it's the opposite of selfish.
Correct.
So yeah, So anyway, I love what you're doing with the kids.
So I just need to, again, identify who we are, and I'm going to do that, and then I'll ask you one more question, and then I will get ready to close out. So hang on.
WPSC 88.7 FM, Wayne, New Jersey.
Part of the William Patterson Broadcast Network.
Broadcasting from Hamilton Hall,
the Marconi Award-winning college radio station of the year.
Jersey's home for alt hip-hop.
Brave New Radio.
A tune-in and Radio FX station.
Yes, indeed. You're listening to Brave New Radio. My guest this morning is Sara Church, and we're talking about her book, Mending My Mind. My last question for you, and then what we're going to do is when after we discuss this last question, what I do is I turn the mic off and I allow you the opportunity to promote. And you can say anything you'd like to say, with the exception of a dollar amount. You can shout, anybody you'd like out. You can shout your publicist out. You can any book signings, where you're going to be, websites, how to get in touch, anything you want to do, with the exception of how much things cost. You will be able to do that. But my last question for you is, as someone who is supporting you, what are words or encouraging words to say to someone who is in the situation that you're describing in terms of, dealing with any of the mental health? If you're now the supporter, what are some encouraging words? Because just telling you to be happy don't get it. Just telling you to cheer up or suck it up, like that doesn't get it. So what are some encouraging words that would actually help move you?
Yeah. a couple of things, and they're really kind of practical words, and not only kind of pie in the sky. Take it one day at a time, just one day at a time, and sometimes it's 1 hour at a time or 10 minutes at a time. And number two, take as good care of yourself as possible, because the better care you can take of yourself, the better care that you can, be there for someone you love that's dealing with a challenge.
No, my question is, what do you say to the person who's dealing with the challenge? What words? What are there any words that would help? Because what I'm saying is, you can't just tell somebody who's struggling with depression or any of these mental health and just get happy. Why aren't you happy? Why aren't you laughing? Why aren't you smiling? Oh, the world is great. Today is great. Look at the sunshine out there. Why aren't you happy? You can't say that to them.
Yeah, that the words are not going to be nearly as important as the actions, actually. So because you can't fix anything for anyone, they have to fix everything for themselves. But you can offer support, and that support does help. And mostly it could be "I love you," or sitting with somebody in the messiness of the mess, and just sitting there and not saying anything. Being wordless is almost more powerful, in my experience.
That's interesting, because that's what all the research in the books have said. They've said the exact same thing. Just, I'm there for you. I'll listen to you. I'm there to listen. Exactly what you just said. That's what the literature and the research says. So that's interesting to hear it from someone who suffered with it. They're saying, yes, for whoever's supporting me, these are the things that's important to me. Yeah,
when I was, before I healed stuff, I wanted to blame and put things on other people. But that wasn't okay. It was then, when the people closest to me, set boundaries, that actually helped me. Just kind of sat with me, I'm here if you need anything, but I can't fix this for you.
Right.
And now I have a wonderful relationship with my ex, and because, just knowing someone cares and they're here, but it's still on you, as she took care of and treated herself well, because no one can fix it for you.
Right. Well, that was my last question. And as I said, I'm going to shut the microphone off, and you get the opportunity to promote, shout out, whatever you'd like to do for the next few minutes. Like I said, anything with the exception of a dollar amount, the microphone is yours.
Oh, well, thank you so much. The only things I want to promote are a few credible websites that have been helpful to me. The CDC's Adverse Childhood Experiences. There's a lot of information about childhood trauma and the impacts it can have on our development. C-PTSD Foundation.org has a lot of great information for people who've had a series of kind of smaller traumatic events or big traumatic events over time that may be impacting us. Inspirational things were very helpful to me, like listening to Oprah Winfrey's Super Soul Sunday and digesting, a lot of positive information, shows exactly like this, Mark. These sorts of filling myself with kind of people doing positive things in the world was helpful to me. And then I list all the books that were helpful to me in healing on my website, sarachurch.org. Every great book, that I read along the way.
Well, I thank you for sharing your story, because it's not an easy story to share. So the fact that you're sharing it, you really are helping others and making life better for others. So I applaud you for that. I applaud you for the transparency. The same thing like with Naomi Osaka and Simone Biles and Jay Glazer and all of folks who are dealing in something, because I didn't realize the percentage was high until I started researching this. The percentage of folks struggling is high. The chances of you encountering someone who's struggling in your workplace or in your social gatherings or at church or on the street, the percentages are high. And I didn't realize that until last year. And since I've been doing research on the topic, I had no clue. I had no idea, but now I do. And that's why I've been sharing as well on the air and the various guests that I've had on to just be aware. And again, it's going back to that. And I told the boys this the other day, and my boys are young. Most of my parents are young. So I said, you guys may have never heard this, but I know when I was growing up as a child, my mom and dad and teachers and all them say, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. if you can't say something nice about somebody, just don't, if you can't be building them up, please don't do anything to tear them down. Just be kind, because you really don't know what people are going through.
Absolutely. The Dalai Lama actually says the same thing, try to make the world better. But if you can't do that, and I'm butchering the words, just don't make it worse.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So I thank you so much. We will be in touch. What'll happen is I record this and it's on my YouTube channel. And so what I do is, and this weekend, I don't think I'm going to get it done today or this weekend because I'm not going to be home. However, by Monday or Tuesday or so, and maybe I'll get it done. I don't know. It depends. You will get a copy of the YouTube link and the MP3 link. And once you get them, you can use them however you'd like.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
All right. So thank you for joining me. I'll be in touch with you. I'll email you the links. And again, use them however you like.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mark.
All right. Take care now.
You too.
All right.